In your two most recent Solari reports, Planet Debts and Infrastructure, Conquest or Creation, two fascinating and very comprehensive reports.
Thank you.
But first, let's take a look at this Washington Post headline that says, Minimum wage offensive could speed arrival of robot-powered restaurants. So can you tell me what's going on with robotics and what they're planning on here? Obviously the companies can get an enormous boost and benefit from using this automation. But are we talking about, robot bartenders and driverless taxis? How far are they going to take this?
Potentially, it's going to go very far. You're looking at robotics, everything.
Yeah. So the question is that dangerous?
Very dangerous. I mean, that's why you're hearing these warnings about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the theory is that you create hardware and software and you give it artificial intelligence and it's useful. And the theory is you're going to keep it under human control.
Mm-hmm.
And that asks all sorts of questions about the humans who control the robots versus the humans who don't. But then I think there's a really serious issue of, are the robots going to, decide that they're smarter than we are and take control of all the humans. I mean, there's serious risk issues.
So this whole Skynet Terminator mythology is basically what we're looking at now. And they had a vision of this about 25 years ago.
Well, have you ever watched Battlestar Galactica?
Yes.
Battlestar Galactica is the story of of the human race creating essentially robots, and the robots organizing a revolt and killing all the humans.
Right.
And that's basically, are we dealing with Battlestar Galactica issues? It's coming, yes, it is coming.
Well, it's an unnerving trend, and I noticed in your report that you say they're really ramping it up now. The robotics are kicking in big time.
Right.
But why the great rush towards robotics now? Do they feel that they need to do this fast before the public catches on to how it will affect their lives in the long run?
I think you're looking, first we started to rebalance the global economy. And because of the tensions of the geopolitics, there's a great deal, moving everything abroad helped to bust the unions. But now that the unions are, pretty much busted, you can build up the automation here and bring a lot of that back. And now it's economic to do that because, one, you've busted the unions, but two, you've brought the automation up to a next step. Now, here's the reality. If you look at the issues faced by a business owner who's looking at hiring another person versus automation, automation in many cases is clearly more attractive.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a business owner, automate, anytime you can automate, it makes sense to do it.
Okay.
I mean, that's the fundamental economics on the ground. Our automation is making very powerful sense. Now, I'm not saying that culturally a lot hasn't been done to cause humans to behave in ways that make them unattractive employees.
Right.
So that has happened. But the reality is once you let the technology out of the lab, it's a fait accompli and I, for one, think that humans have other things to do than sit around and do. If you look at a lot of the jobs that robots are doing, I'd rather have kids studying philosophy than flipping out hamburgers at McDonald's.
Uh-huh.
Now, the problem is, are we going to fund them studying philosophy? Is the question. But there's no doubt that we are going to see very significant implementation. Well, we're seeing it now. At the industrial, within the industrial application within business, the integration of robotics is flying. And you're going to start to see it more and more. I think that one of the stories I posted was the first hotel in Japan, which is all robotics.
Right.
So, for example, if you're Japan and you have a demographics winner, you don't have a lot of kids coming up. Robotics makes enormous sense.
I see.
So, here's the thing: it's coming because all the people who can integrate it into their business, it's a no-brainer to do it. It's very attractive to do it. And if you don't do it, the guy who does it is going to beat you.
Hmm.
So everyone's going to do it at high speed.
Well, it's very interesting. And I know you've been talking about the outsourcing of white collar jobs in America, and that's the next wave that's coming in. And then we have this robotics that will be having a major impact on the regular job market. And I start to wonder, if we're outsourcing these white collar jobs and we replace the blue collar ones with automation, then where will the American worker fit in?
Well, it's worse than that because if you look at what Obamacare is going to do, Obamacare and Common Care are basically one plan.
Hmm.
And what you do is you standardize the process. So you standardize healthcare, you standardize education, and then you re-engineer all of it into software and online systems.
Right.
And that way you can cut out the labor.
Okay.
So you're looking between Obamacare and Common Care at cutting out more than several trillion dollars worth of labor.
That's
Now,
amazing.
yeah, no, but you're basically taking two of the last parts of the local economy that produce any or support any kind of middle class employment, and you're gonna squeeze a tremendous amount of it out.
Hmm.
It's very significant, and very few communities understand what's coming, what's happening. But that's going to be very, very significant. And on top of the automation and the more outsized or outsourcing, now what some of the debate about is, well, it's no different than the industrial revolution. So a lot of people are no longer needed on the farm, so they adapt and you create other things to do.
Right.
And so the question is, we're going to break free a tremendous amount of capacity. Where is that capacity going to go? What's it going to do?
Yeah.
Because there are many things that need doing, but it's really a question of both markets and government policy, whether I live in a place in the South where a lot of the capacity doesn't go anywhere. It just gets Social Security, disability, and food stamps and, goes down to Walmart and slowly gets poisoned to death.
Right. I see what you mean. So, in terms of planning their economic moves, the forces that are leading this charge don't even need to concern themselves with the labor part of the equation.
Right.
Those people who get thrown out of work, they'll collect some small check, maybe unemployment. And for them, that's basically the cost of doing business, getting rid of these people out of the workforce.
Well, there was some policy thought in the 90s, and maybe that's it. But basically, let's give everybody a check for $600 a month. They'll live on that. And then we'll do everything, abroad or with robots.
Right,
So
right.
now, if you look at disability and food stamps, I think they've got everybody on 1,500 a month or something. But it's clearly headed down. And I haven't looked into it yet, but apparently there's legislation because the disability fund is empty now, proposing to merge the trust fund with the disability fund so that instead of protecting the trust fund, which everybody's paid into, you run it out on disability, which would, if things keep going in the general direction, the demand would keep skyrocketing as automation came in.
Uh-huh.
So basically, rather than fund, so all the businesses are making money from automating and all the robotics manufacturers are making money from making the robotics, but essentially you're stealing retirement savings from people who've invested it in the trust fund
Hmm.
to finance that.
I see.
And you've got another serious fairness issue.
As if they haven't king. And some interesting things happen
Right.
to you, which really will give the key to entrainment. So, can you share that experience with us now?
Sure. It was an investment conference. It was an old conference in New Orleans, and I had dealt with entrainment before, but never in a conference kind of setting. And it was funny because I was out in Hawaii being briefed about entrainment. I was with a scientist who was briefing me on a series of issues, one of which was entrainment. And he was showing me how it works on TV. He had a big flat screen TV and was giving me all these. And I later had him come do a salary report on entrainment because I was so concerned. I was struggling with it being used in money situations, encouraging people to invest both in liquid securities or in private equity in a way that made no sense, and so I would have clients coming to me wanting to buy something that was clearly ludicrous, but they were completely, in a state of rapture about the thing. And you were, you really, even using cold math, it was a struggle to get them out of it. Anyway, so I really got concerned that my clients were losing money over this. And so I asked them to do a great Solari report. All Solari report subscribers are heavily lobbied by me to listen to it. Sort of the protect your money from mind control.
Oh, yeah.
Solari report. Anyway, but I had read, when I had studied, I'd done a whole series on Enron when Enron was going on, because I was looking for the $4 trillion that was going missing from the federal government. And I finally came upon a theory that they were laundering it through Enron, is what I believe.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so I'm studying Enron, and then when Enron imploded, I got all sorts of transcripts from various people on some of the analyst meetings they'd had.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read I'd look at the PowerPoint and I'd read the transcript, and I'd think there's nothing great here. But the analysts would just get so unbelievably excited, and I realized, oh my God, they're using entrainment technology at these analyst meetings. And no, that's my theory. I can't prove that, but it's the only way to explain the phenomena. And it certainly fit with what I was dealing with clients who were having it used, in that case, on the phone or on the internet. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and or on TV. Anyway, so I go into this conference, and I'm late to the big grand ballroom speeches. So we had Dick Armey speaking and the George Tenet. And I open the doors to the grand ballroom, and Armey's already speaking. And this wave comes over me, Daniel. When I tell you, I was like, holy cow, they're using. So I thought, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to get to experience it in a speech. So I walk in, and there was a great guy there from New Jersey, very successful entrepreneur, who really was very grounded and had, smart guy, hard to trick. And so I thought, I'm going to sit next to him because, I've got to be very careful not to let this stuff sway. So I take notes, and I keep having like this thing running in my mind. There's entrainment, I have to be careful. There's entrainment, I have to be careful. I'm taking notes. And at one point, I put my head down just to really get the line written down. And everyone started clapping. And I suddenly dropped my pen and started clapping, and turned to the next guy and said, "Isn't he wonderful?" I'm like, no, he's not. He's terrible. What am I doing? It was stunning to me, because I knew what was going on, and everyone was like in a state of rapture. Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he wonderful? So at the end of Army's speech, they start taking questions from the audience, and I thought, oh my God, they're going to let me ask questions. So George Tenet comes up, and George Tenet had just left the CIA.
Yeah.
And of course, George Tenet had been CIA director, I guess, during the 9/11. Anyway, his speech was on the legislation they were trying to pass. I forget what the name was. The theory being it could coordinate the enforcement and intelligence more closely. And his speech was all about the failure of 9/11 was a failure to coordinate, which I don't agree with, but that was his speech.
Right.
And anyway, so the whole time I'm thinking, oh my God, they're going to let me ask him a question. So the crowd isn't just in a state of rapture. Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he? The whole world. I don't know if have you ever experienced this stuff where it's really strong? Everything feels like it's resonating.
Yeah.
It's resonating very powerfully. And in the meantime, I'm trying to figure out, how are they delivering it? I mean, it has to be electronic, but how are they delivering it? So I get up. They start to take questions at the end of Tenet's speech. So I get up, and naturally I'm the first question. So I said, Mr. Tenet, and of course he knows who I am. I said, Mr. Tenet, my name is Catherine Austin Fitz. Can you explain why the Air Force stood down 4 times on 9/11?
Oh.
And suddenly, it's like the whole trance broke. He turned bright red. Now, in political speech making, when you get a question you don't want to answer, you're taught. I was taught for years. I was part of a surrogate speaking program, and we were taught by Roger Ailes and his guys, sort of how to speak on behalf of the Republican Party. When you get a question you don't want to answer, the first thing you say is you say something very solicitous and warm and wonderful to the person. Daniel, thank you. That is such an excellent question. And then you pull a complete non sequitur and you answer the question you wish you'd gotten.
Right, right. Yeah.
So you are nice to the person because you can't be mean. That's terrible. And then you proceed to just ignore the question. So Tannen apparently didn't get the course. He froze, he turned bright red. They clearly thought they had an ace audience. I think they just thought, And then he said, "Well, my dear," in a very sarcastic, dripping tone. And that just like broke the trance everywhere. Everybody was like scared. What's the matter?
Whoa.
And he said, "Well, my dear, perhaps you didn't notice I was the head of the CIA, not the head of the Air Force. Maybe you should ask the Air Force." Now, that's what a bureaucrat says. It's not me, it's him. Go look, this kind of
Right.
thing. And everybody's looking at him because it completely contradicts what he said, which is we need more coordination.
Exactly.
Okay, so for him to say, "I don't know, I wasn't in the Air Force, not my business, this."
Yeah.
So they said the guy is afraid, the guy is, and suddenly everybody, but it just broke the trance.
Yeah. Well, no more spell.
And my feedback for months after that, first of all, Tennant then proceeded to give a series of speeches about why we needed to regulate the internet. And there was too many people out there saying ridiculous things on the internet. But so it was sort of an anti-free speech thing. But then the other thing was, I had many, many people come back and say, it completely changed the perspective of the audience, uh, that they had seen he was afraid, and they dug in, and probably as a result of that, brought more gold. So
Wow.
the gold dealers were all thrilled with what I'd done because they were doing more business. Anyway, but it was remarkable. I've been in speeches where I've seen it used since then, and it was a remarkable experience in terms of how powerful this stuff can be if people don't know it exists.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and you
Right.
think about the fact that they've had subliminal programming since the 50s at least. We can imagine how powerful this stuff is now
Right.
because the entrainment technology is so sophisticated. And
Right.
I guess that brings us to your vision of mind control as a kind of regular function of how many of these groups operate. Whether we're talking about corporate, government, or institutional forces, when they need to accomplish something, they'll employ something like entrainment technology to get it done. And that is mind control.
Right. Well, you see mind control throughout our society. So when we go to church, the pastors are trained to sort of build a crowd in certain ways and come together.
Hmm.
And you could argue that that's mind control, but I think the whole art of manipulation and persuasion is very, very significant. And what I tried to talk about in the second quarter or in the first quarter wrap up was the extent to which it's being brought down to a one-on-one basis, because the financial harvesting is now occurring at a one-on-one basis. And if I can give you a smartphone and a computer and a television, and I can use entrainment and digital technology to manipulate you through those systems on a one-on-one basis using artificial intelligence. So we don't need a human being. We don't have to pay a human being on the other side to do this. We can do this all with, software and databases and artificial intelligence. But if I can basically put you in certain kinds of states and use that to sell you things or get you to make certain kind of investments, then I can literally financially or politically harvest you,
Hmm.
get you to support certain policies. And that, so let's say I want to, I want to make a fortune on prison stocks. I can get you to support, mandating much longer sentences so my prison stocks fly up. It's on and on and on and on, but it's happening now at a one-on-one basis. The horrible thing about my life is I feel like every year I welcome more people into my world. It's like, well, okay, and part of the challenge has been I keep trying to warn them, and they can't fathom that the world is as different as it is.
Yeah.
Because one of the things we'll have to go through is that process of, oh, I'm a patsy, because we believe something other than what it was. So we're all having to kind of deprogram from being a patsy. But once you deprogram from being a patsy, the beauty of it is then you're free. But no one gets to be free without taking responsibility.
Quite a lot of chaos there. So where is this going based on their latest moves?
I think that what you will now see is the Germans and Northern Europeans essentially harvest Greece.
Uh-huh.
So you'll
They
see,
got what they wanted.
right, you'll see privatization. One of the big questions I had for while the whole transaction was or deals were going on was why don't they have a plan? Why don't they have an exit plan to leave the euro? Why don't they have a plan to issue drachma? Why? And what finally came out from the finance minister is when they tried to put one together, there were two problems. One, the politics were so sensitive and the opposition to doing it was so enormous, number one. But number two, the equivalent of their IRS was on software and systems that they didn't control. They were controlled by the banks.
Oh.
And this brings back to the point I'm always making, and I'm sure you've heard me do it before, which is when I was the Assistant Secretary of Housing or the lead financial advisor at HUD, I would try and get data from the defense contractor that ran the payment information systems, and they refused to give it to me. And literally, the sovereign government did not control the information and payment systems. The private corporations did, and they were reporting to a shadow government, not to the official government. And that's why the President of the United States does not control or run the country, because those defense contractors run the information and payment systems, and they control the guts. And then the New York Fed member banks control and operate as depositories. So they run the bank accounts and the financial systems and do a lot of the financial servicing, and the big defense contractors run a lot of the information and other payment systems. And between the two of them, they control and they report to the shadow government or themselves. They do not report to the line operating officials.
Yeah, fascinating. We never get to see
Right.
that.
So if the middle class is going to have reassert authority, you're going to have to reassert authority of the digital systems.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how do you do that? Because the sovereign government doesn't control them. Congress does not control them. The president does not control them. Now, what they control is they control the appropriations. But you literally have to get into the guts of how the money works. Well, here's the thing. If you take everything I've ever learned about the economy on planet Earth, what I would tell you is the Earth is a REIT. Do you know what a REIT is? A real estate investment trust.
Right.
And it's paying a tithe. And I don't know where that tithe is going. I don't know if it's going underground. I don't know if we're building colonies on Mars. All I can tell you is, there's this steady drain. It's being harvested. I don't know if you've seen the movie Jupiter Ascending. There's this great line where the protagonist is fighting with somebody on another planet. And they said, look, Earth is just a very small part of a much bigger corporation.
Interesting.
Now, the funny thing about that line is that's exactly how the economic model works. It's like every year they want a bigger dividend.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And you're constantly having to produce a dividend. People are fighting, when they can't produce enough and that's what it feels like. Now, I'm not saying it's true, but if you're going to grapple with what the leadership is up to, then the question is, are they really the leaders or are they just in the middle?
Good question.
And the reality is much of what happens to us in the next 5 years, Daniel, relates to the politics of what's going on with the dollar.
Huh. Okay.
Okay. So after 9/11, we embarked on a journey of dramatically spending trillions of dollars to create a worldwide empire and assert control of the Middle East and the Silk Road. And if you look at what the plan was, I have to tell you the plan failed. And we overshot the budget. And I think if you look at what Kerry and the current administration are doing is they're running around the world trying to lower the risk and get the budget back into balance.
And that's what the Iran deal is all about.
Yeah, because they're saying, look, we can't afford
to bomb you. So let's make some business deals instead.
Right. In other words, we can't You can talk about whether this is a good deal or not, but we don't have, at this point, the financial capacity to wage this war anymore.
Well, thank God they don't.
Interesting story. One of my favorite things to read, John Rappaport for many years would interview insiders, and he would let them stay anonymous, and then he would have them. The power of these interviews was he would dig in and get them to explain the nuts and bolts of how control worked. How does control work if you're a nurse or a doctor or a priest inside the Vatican? Or, he was really interested in the nuts and bolts of how they made how is the matrix engineered? How does this whole thing work without it being obvious that it's rigged? And he did a marvelous job. This went on for years. It's thousands of pages.
And this is Ellis Medavoy.
Ellis Medavoy. So
Yeah.
yeah, so Ellis Medavoy is interviewing Ellis Medavoy, and Ellis Medavoy was, I believe, did public relations for the Executive Committee of Council on Foreign Relations or some group like that.
Okay.
And Ellis Medavoy is talking about how they manipulate and control, and it's great. These interviews do a great job of explaining how it really works. It's fantastic. And so Ellis started to do these interviews after he had retired, and he had started reading Rappaport, and one thing led to another. They got into cahoots. So at one point, John gets very frustrated and he explodes and says, look, if we're so stupid and you guys are so smart and you can manipulate everything, why are you even talking to me? And that's when Medavoy kind of cracks, and he says, well, the funny thing is every time we thought we had it locked down, this thing would happen. And basically what he describes, in my words, is the divine intelligence showing up in a way that it's totally out of control.
Huh.
You can't quite lock it down because you've got this.
Right.
And all the plans of all the, all control just can't quite get it. Because let's face it, I just think you can't control one planet with force and with central control. I just think it's too big, it's too organic, and the force of nature and the divine intelligence is too powerful. So, I think all this stuff is going to fail. It's just it can do a lot of harm and hurt a lot of. It is doing a lot of harm and hurting a lot of people. But at some point, it's not going to work. And so I'm an optimist, and that's I just proceed day to day on the theory that it doesn't have to work if enough people just wake up.
Huh. So that's what it is. Their control game is basically a losing proposition ultimately, when you get right down to it.
I believe so. But, my whole life, in defense of Mr. Global, throughout my whole life, all I've seen is the people doing the crime get more and more fashionable and more powerful.
That's true.
So,
well, it's an important principle you're pointing out here, which is these people get put on a pedestal. They get rewarded for being a successful criminal.
Right.
Well, Catherine, you work closely with some of these power players in government and on Wall Street for years, and you got a real up-close look at them. How do you feel now, looking back at that period of time?
I am very, very happy to be out. In other words, if you look at my life now, I am much happier than I was when I was inside. And I just find that whole environment to get more and more perverted, more and more ugly. In other words, it feels horrible.
Yeah.
And I just a lot of this comes down to, whether you want to be very wealthy and have a big title and feel terrible.
Right.
You like. So, but it's a very
degenerated.
Yeah, it's a very debased, degenerated way to live, and it kind of feels like Rome at the end. And it's a very insecure way to live. Everybody's always. I mean, it's just a very unpleasant existence, and a very insecure existence. So I have to say. I'm much happier where I am. So maybe that's why I am where I am. But
right, exactly. Well, looking at that world from the outside now, after having been inside there, you can see how really dysfunctional it is. And it's even more dysfunctional now than it was even when you were there.
Right. Much, much.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It is. So that raises the question again: is who's really in control, and how does the governance system really work? Um, and what are the risks they're dealing with? Because the one thing I will tell you is, um, I can't say that the corruption at the top is that much worse than the corruption at the bottom.
Mm.
The planet is on a model, particularly the United States is on a model. That model runs on force, and we're all participating, and most of us are supporting it. And the karma is all of ours. We're all, you know,
So fighting the power may be kind of a false choice.
well, not a false choice, but I think every person, if you look at what every person could do in their life, if they chose not to feed the machinery and to try and make sure with everything they did with their time and their money to give life to themselves, their family, their community, and the general economy, you know, things would evolve in a very powerful way.
Sure.
So we all have the power culturally and financially to make enormous changes. So this is ultimately going to come down to 300 million people and what we choose.
And the stakes are.
The stakes are whether our children and grandchildren are going to be free or slaves. I mean, where this is headed right now is into slavery. And the absence of any personal, physical, or emotional or mental freedoms. I mean, you're talking about technology that is designed to control people's bodies, control people's minds, control their lives, to harvest them financially. So we're really talking about, are we going to be slaves or are we going to be free?
And would you say we're at a crucial point, especially since we've only had the technology for a short time?
Something, I thought it was crucial when I was 5. And for many, many years, I worked very hard to try and find options and solutions or to understand it, because I don't want to be a slave and I don't want to see anybody else being a slave. And it was really funny when I decided, I tried very hard to figure out how to have kids and I finally gave up because I couldn't figure out how to protect them. I couldn't, I knew if I had a child, I was going to end up in prison because I was going to shoot somebody protecting them, and
Yeah,
then I'm going to
right.
have a mess. I mean, you try and give a kid a vaccine behind my back,
Ho
I'm going to
ho.
kill you. It's going to
Yeah,
be ugly. So,
absolutely.
right. So it was when I decided that it was hopeless to have kids, I said, okay, well, I have a real obligation to everyone else to try and create a world where I could be free to have kids. And so this has been going on. I thought it was an emergency then.
Right. I can appreciate that.
And, and I think step one is the transparency of Houston, we have a problem. And you tell me, Daniel, because I see more and more people starting to realize we have a problem and willing to face it.
Definitely.
But I've spent my whole life looking for various avenues. And, I have to tell you, one decision I made, when I started litigating with the federal government, and especially when I decided I was really going to fight instead of settle, I just said, okay, I have two groups in my life, and one is trying to kill the other, and I'm not going to let that happen. And so if I have to choose one, I'm going to choose the people who really, I'm going to choose my heart, because I'm not going to let these people get genocided without doing my very best to stop it. And I thought at the time that they were just targeting minority communities. I didn't realize it was everybody.
Right, exactly.
So it turned out it was everybody, but I didn't know it then. Anyway, so I just thought it was poor people. So that was a big step. But the second step was, When I speak publicly, I'm going to speak about everything.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to. I'm going to be very careful about what I censor. And if you look at the financial world, even in the alternative media, there's certain topics which are not touchable.
Yes.
And they're the very topics you have to talk about if you want to get to the heart of the matter. So if we want to understand the economy, we have to look at the hidden system of finance. We have to look at covert cash flows. We have to look at the black budget. We have to look at all of these things because they are driving the train. And yet they are considered socially unacceptable to discuss. And I just said, I don't care. I want to get to the real solutions, and I have to go through reality. I can't, the reality train tracks. You have to stay on reality to get to solutions, whatever they are. So to a certain extent, I'm still driving, trying to find reality, because the big question is who really governs it and why, what's really going on. And I honestly don't know the answer.
Yeah.
I had a real fun once. I gave an interview, and I'm trying to remember if it was Dark Journalist or not. I gave an interview, and somebody wrote a comment that said, well, she's a liar because she says that she doesn't know who's really running things, but she worked, in Wall Street, Washington. So, she knows. So she's a liar. And you wanted to say, no, fella, what you need to understand is really that bad. You have people running the country who don't understand what's going on. That's how bad it is.
Oh, it makes this episode a real unique breakthrough, as we're not only going to examine the corporate media's role in promoting propaganda, but also look closely at streams of disinformation stories being pushed in alternative media circles, and who is behind them. Is censorship getting a new face? Here we go. Former Assistant Housing Secretary Catherine Austin Fitts. Media disinfo, false memes, and adult fairy tales.
I'm assuming that the intelligence agencies, both public and private, float these things, and they see what, they've got lots of people on the payroll. It's the biggest job program in America, COINTELPRO, 20.0. They float these things and they see what they can get traction and energy by. And they're developed around fear, fear, greed, and the need for emotional satisfaction. The reality is, if you look at what's happening, we're dealing with legal, financial, physical debasement across every aspect of our life.
I started doing these special Dark Journalist reports and interviews because I saw a complete disassociation between the official reality that we were being spoon-fed by the corporate media and the actual situation on the ground, which is often obscured by covert forces operating in a shady twilight between government institutions, corporate entities, and a black budget underworld. I managed to identify 3 levels of information in any important story or deep event, such as the financial coup d'etat of 2008. These 3 levels are: 1. The official story, often in place to guard the real story. 2. The counter story, put out by diligent researchers and distorted by the media as conspiracy theory. 3. Third force narratives, or junk conspiracy, where a bizarre meme is used to try and alienate those looking into alternative research and discourage average people from doubting the official story. The process of examining and decoding these 3 different levels is what I call dark journalism, where we go deeper than the official reality, but also avoid the junk conspiracy third force stories. We drive deep into the heart of the facts and find those experts who can help us reveal the mystery. So with all that in mind, let's go talk with Catherine Austin Fitts. Catherine, it's great to see you, and welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Now, we have so many great things to cover today, but let's start with this. Over the past decade, we've had so many conspiracies come out of the shadows and be revealed as true. From the Snowden revelations about NSA surveillance of average Americans, to the manipulation of our financial system by a small group of insiders, people are getting the message that reality is not what the corporate media told them it was.
Yeah.
Along with that new awareness, we're seeing major levels of distraction by forces in the mainstream and alternative media, creating these elaborate memes to take that new awareness that people have and steer it into confusion. Now, I've put together a list of some of these memes here, and I'd like to get you to comment on them. So the first one is the White Dragon family is rescuing the economy.
Right. This is one of my favorites.
Then there's Kabbalists are pending, the Alliance for Good are negotiating their surrender.
Right. That one's been going on for quite a while.
That's true, it has
There
been.
are different versions and variations, but no need to act because it's all about to pop. So you can just lay back and
Yeah, the elites are being arrested, and there's going to be tribunals where they are put on trial. The cabal will go to jail, and behind the scenes, the good guys are in charge, really. So, no need to worry.
what we're going to hang all the partners at Goldman Sachs.
Well, that sounds more like wish fulfillment, and we'll get into that. So, we're seeing this large scale manipulation of the message, and at the same time, the public awareness is rising. So, now we have all these stories out there, and they appear to be part of this awakening. But in fact, when we look a little closer, what they're doing is co-opting this wave of insight and polluting the information, in fact. Somehow they are switching the narrative out down this other path. So my question is, who is it that is doing this?
Well, I'm assuming that they're coming from a variety of I'm assuming that the intelligence agencies, both public and private, float these things and they see they've got lots of people on the payroll. It's the biggest job program in America, COINTELPRO, 20.0. And, they float these things and they see what they can get traction and energy by. And they're developed around fear, fear, greed, and the need for emotional satisfaction. The reality is, if you look at what's happening, we're dealing with legal, financial, physical debasement across every aspect of our life, and it's very grinding. It's very, so dealing with that reality in the real world can be very unexciting.
Sure.
Okay, and what all of these things have, whether they hit our fear or our greed, is they have, it's we used to have a course at the university that I studied at called The Romance of Sex and Alcohol and Tobacco. They all have sex and romance to them, and they play on our desire for something a little more exciting and sacred than the debasement of what I call the slow burn. And one of the things they offer, whether they play the fear side or the greed side, is they play on people's desire for hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very tragic because, in fact, hope comes from facing reality and finding the pathway that can shift things. And if you're not prepared to deal with the nuts and bolts of reality, you're never going to find that path. You're going to go in these sort of cycles that never touch the train tracks. And that's part of the goals of this story is they're trying to keep you from touching the train tracks of power and money. So it's how can we keep everybody preoccupied while we control the train tracks? So do you know what the third rail is? You've got a subway system where you live.
Yes.
So the third rail is the train or the trolley runs on the tracks, and then the third rail carries the electricity. Well, they want to keep everybody away from the third rail.
I see.
They want to control the third rail, and whether it's the fear version or the greed version, they've got everybody going in circles, which leaves them free to control the third rail.
Well, that's really fascinating. And of course, those are some of the more positive memes that are floating around out there. That type of adult fairy tale.
Right.
But then we also have these negative ones. And you can spot fear porn better than just about anybody. Of course, being in that financial world, there are always people and pundits coming up to you and saying, we are going into a total economic collapse.
Right.
And it gets repeated ad nauseum. So the sky is always falling.
This is what has shocked me the most, because I will have people come to me who are very well educated and very intelligent. And when we start, they'll come in and they'll say, Shemitah is happening in September and the whole global economy is going to crash.
Right. And here we are in December.
And you think, how in the world could someone, with this experience and this accomplishment buy this? Is one of the reasons I believe that one of the real problems is entrainment. I think We were coming into a fall where a lot of big decisions had been, the can had been kicked. And it was clear we were facing a lot of big shifts, including the ongoing in the SDR system and some of these other issues. So it was going to be, geopolitically, it was going to be a very tense fall, and it clearly has been. But rather than people looking at the reality of what was coming up, there were again this whole range of adult fairy tales, Shemitah being the most, sort of prominent, ridiculous. And I'm convinced, Daniel, from sort of just interacting with the people I did, that they had literally digested a huge amount of entrainment and sort of subliminal programming. And that's why on the Solari report, I try and get every subscriber to listen to or read our Solari report on the use of entrainment technology to trick people in terms of how they invest their money.
Yeah.
So, and this is something I've talked with you a lot about. I just pointed out that we have a video now up of a university professor from University of California, Davis, talking about how this kind of technology is being used on kids, and that's why we're seeing this bizarre behavior at universities around the country. So I think with respect to this fall, they were using entrainment to kind of play off what clearly was coming up was going to be a tense time. So they and they kind of created a lot of resonation in the fields, about that time, which was clearly going to be a tense time. So in that sense, the fairy tales aligned with the reality energetically.
That's interesting. And on some level, I expect that from the mainstream media, who really have only become much worse since they've been centralized into just 6 companies controlling the vast majority of news that we see.
Right.
But now we're seeing this COINTELPRO 2.0 factor creeping into the alternative media and ultimately rendering us powerless to act on that new information. It's also deliberately attempting to marginalize alternative media to the point where a reporter like me won't even want to be associated with it, the same way I don't want to be associated with the corporate media. So it's a very sophisticated op.
Right. I think, my experience has been in many respects the alternative media is worse than the corporate media.
Huh.
Although the corporate media is getting pretty ridiculous. So, the corporate media was always the official story, but it has only recently become what I call the shriekometer.
Right.
So, they've both become shriekometers. And I think part of it is that, whether it's the happy adult fairy tale or the fear adult fairy tale, hope sells and fear sells. Reality, is difficult and complicated and depressing sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And to get something done in reality requires action. And that means dealing with the COINTELPRO that happens when you have weather, as you have weather problems when you start to take action. So reality is a lot harder. There's another dynamic that's going on too, Daniel, and that is, if I stick with adult fairy tales, then whether it's the problem or the solution, it's a stranger. A stranger is the problem, and a stranger is the solution. Okay, so we have, the Asian white dragon families are the savior, and they're going to solve us. Or E.T. is the Lone Ranger and is going to come down in his UFO and save us. There's no requirement to look at intimate responsibilities. So the fact that people in my community, my neighbors, are dealing drugs, I don't have to look at. And I'm not talking about marijuana, I'm talking about hard narcotics.
Mm-hmm.
Or that the bank I bank at is laundering money. Or that, my brother or sister is at Goldman Sachs doing these things. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So it gets very ugly when you have to start looking at the intimate picture. It's funny, I started warning people in 1998 about the housing bubble. And I warned them all the way through the crash and the bailouts, and then I had to listen for many years why they would ask me, why did nobody warn us? I said, well, wait a minute, I risked my life to warn you. You don't even remember. But what I saw was the housing bubble was not engineered by people in Wall Street and Washington. Certainly they started it and ran it, but it was engineered by mortgage bankers, home builders, appraisers, title insurance people, and professionals in every county in America. Everybody was, and the opposition I got was not just from the top guys. The opposition I got was people saying, "Hey, we're having a party. Don't mess it up."
Right.
So, so there is an unwillingness to look at the intimacy of the evil that we're dealing with.
I see.
I mean, since World War II, we've run around the world and subsidized ourselves by debasing everyone with the dollar or doing what we do militarily around the world. And most Americans have been the beneficiary of that, and nobody wants to look at it. So, I'll give you an example. The reason I took the position many years ago that we were going to slow burn and we weren't going to collapse
Uh-huh.
is because I had a firsthand education in how the surveillance and manipulation and control works, because I dealt with the litigation. And I saw the depth of how the matrix is engineered, and that there is a matrix. I lived it, and I had to reverse engineer it by living it. And so I had a much deeper understanding of how the control works, because I had a very expensive opportunity, thank you to the Department of Justice. And what that taught me was a whole series of things. And when I tried to explain to financial people how the control worked, I literally heard, I try and explain control files and that everybody had a control file. And they would say, "I can't talk about that. I can't go there because what you're telling me is it's hopeless."
Right.
And I would say it's not hopeless at all. But we have to bring transparency to this. We have to look at it. If we can't look at it, then it's hopeless. So we would get into this negative loop where they were telling me it was hopeless because they refused to look at the dark side. And I was trying to show them what the pathway was to break free of the whole control mechanism. And I was believing it was hopeless because they wouldn't go there.
Uh-huh.
So, and this is where, I feel like I've just spent 20 years in this loop.
I can appreciate that.
That's why, like dark journalists, you'll go there.
Definitely.
And we have to go there. We have to go there because the pathway to where we want to go, the dark side's not going to go away. So you bring transparency and you try and shift more and more into the light. That's what you try and do, but it's not going to go away. I don't know if I ever told you, but this is the time when I realized we had really crossed an important border. I was driving down the highway in 2000, I think it was 2002, and my former college roommate at the University of Pennsylvania called me and said, "Fitz, have you seen the latest Tony Soprano TV shows?" And I said, "Yes, I have," because they were about HUD fraud. So there's a classic form of single-family fraud which is used for what I believe is a lot of the covert financing. It's basically single-family fraud that's combined with money laundering, and I talk about it a lot. And so my roommate says, "Well, what you're saying must be true if it's on the Soprano TV show." And I said, "So what you're saying is you don't believe the former Assistant Secretary of Housing and the former lead financial advisor to the Federal Housing Administration, you believe a TV show?" And she said, "Yes, that's right."
Wow.
Which is why I say in America, fact is fiction and fiction is fact. So if Pepsi is saying it, then you're going to have people all over the country saying, "Well, it must be true," even though it's just an ad.
So in a kind of disingenuous fashion, they are adopting what's become popular because they know that so many people are interested in this subject and they need to capture that audience. And the
Right.
subject itself, the mainstream has always ridiculed and helped to keep secret.
Right.
So I find this fascinating. We're actually looking at a mix of entrainment and market share.
Well, I didn't, it all gets back to what is the truth. We're still looking for it. And the danger is that as we, you have the official reality, and then you have us all here trying to figure out what reality is. It's still fluid. And so what you have them doing is trying to control and script that search. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And the danger is they keep infusing disinformation into it. So, and they're very good at doing it.
I'm
To
glad.
me, that's one of the tests of an adult fairy tale that you have to ask yourself when presented with something is, does this help me become more powerful, or does this get me to lay back?
Yes.
So, what when you're faced with a situation that needs changing, the first thing you need is power. You need to figure out, where can I get the power and leverage to really make a difference, whether it's in my own situation or helping the wider situation. Because we're all going to have to find ways of helping our own situation that improve the wider situation. That's the nature of what we're dealing with. Um, and the first solution is we just all stop doing harm.
Well, it's an excellent point, and a close analysis of the media fairy tales of denial with regard to the financial crisis or deep events like 9/11 and the JFK assassination, which were completely misrepresented by the mainstream media in a blatantly dishonest fashion with provably false narratives and designated patsies and all that. It shows that these forces want to hide the deeper implications of these conspiracies. And so now their objective seems to be to take the progress that's been made by the alternative and independent media in getting at the truth and fragment it, balkanize it into confusion by co-opting it with these manipulative memes, basically.
You know, uh, whether it's the fear version, or the big solution in the sky version, both of them distract us and pull us away from finding the power levers that can really make a difference in our situation.
Interesting.
It's a form of disassociation.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that
Yeah.
term, disassociation, because when we come back, we're going to explore how that's being used on an important story rising up from the independent media, the deaths of these holistic MDs, and how these covert forces are attempting to take us off the track of that investigation with the help of the corporate media, of course. Now, Catherine, let's explore a high contrast between a story the alternative media is helping to expose versus an adult fairy tale meme that fits the outline of being planted as a distraction. So first, the large-scale deaths since last summer of these holistic MDs. Now, we've seen some excellent reporting on this from Health Nut News, and I should mention here two other outstanding alternative news websites that I use regularly. One of them is Forbidden Knowledge TV at fktv.is, and also cryptagon.com. These, along with Solari.com and darkjournalist.com, can give you a real picture of what's going on, so I encourage you to visit them. Now, this story of the mysterious deaths of these holistic doctors, men and women in the natural health profession who may have been targeted by big pharma interests because of their research.
Right.
And if that sounds far out to you, it's been widely known, for example, that Merck, the pharmaceutical giant, actually maintained a hit list of doctors and a program to neutralize them from testifying against some of their powerful drugs. Now, this hit list may have acted more in the form of damaging their reputations as opposed to eliminating them, as is the case with the holistic MDs. But some of the language that came out of that Vioxx court case, where this was revealed last spring, was pretty intense, with terms like, let's seek them out and destroy them. That's from actual Merck employees, so quite a story there. And the mainstream media has avoided it. The alternative media is really pushing it. Now, let's go back and take a look at Flat Earth for a moment. The contrast in the quality of these two stories rising out of alternative media quite simultaneously is very remarkable, in my opinion. Story one could blow the lid off corrupt business practices of worldwide corporations with powerful political allies. Story two attempts to ally the alternative media with the ultimate absurdity of Flat Earth. So with one, transparency. With two, we go off the deep end. Interesting pattern there, don't you think?
Right. And it's amazing because you'll see, it's one of the reasons on some of the conferences that we've done together, there's been such a stress on not allowing in any bad dog, any disinformation, and why people get so angry when it does, because there is a force multiplier that happens when when you're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, if every piece that goes on the table has integrity and every player who's trying to put them together has integrity, then you get enormous amounts done. The problem is with one player who does not have integrity or one piece that does not have integrity, it can bollocks the whole thing up. It can even explode the effort. So a little bit of disinformation and a little bit of bad dogs can bollocks up everything, and then the momentum and the flow never get going.
I see.
So, if you look at the natural doctor deaths, there is tremendous amount of dot connecting that could happen if people started to focus on that. So you're right. The more of these things you can create and draw energy away. The other thing is if the natural doctor's death is just one of 50 or 100 stories, there's just too much stuff
Sure.
and then that force multiplier effect doesn't start to happen.
So you become overwhelmed, for example, and immobilized and ultimately disassociated, like you said. What about a story coming out of the mainstream media, for example, like the Paris attacks and the fast rise of ISIS? This is creating that fear atmosphere. And something I learned recently was on the day of the Paris attacks, the military contractor
Right.
stocks rose dramatically, of course, in
Right.
anticipation of a new war and these tensions rising. So we can see that war profiteer connection to keeping the public in a state of fear.
Well, it's what I call the shriekometer. What they're trying to do with the shriekometer, and they did this with Ebola, coming into the elections, they had Ebola. I mean, I've never seen it even the financial press. Every day was like Ebola, Ebola, Ebola. It was like Eddie Murphy in Trading Places. Ebola, Ebola, Ebola. And it just whited out any discussion, and it was the only way for the Republicans to win.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, the Republicans said, we want the Senate. We will do anything we have to do. And what are we going to do? Black people are coming to kill you. And P.S. Here's a black president. It's his fault. It's his fault. And sure enough, the Republicans got the Senate. But it was what I call a shriekometer. And they basically drowned everything out with this fear porn. So now what we're getting the ISIS fear porn. But it's whiting out. If you look at all the big financial things underway and the geopolitics underway, it's whiting out any understanding or discussion of any of them. From basically right before the Paris attacks, Lagarde comes out, or I guess it was that Friday.
That Friday, yeah.
Yeah, so just as it was either right before or right after the Paris attacks, Lagarde comes out and says, we've changed our mind, the yuan is going into the SDR. No one noticed because it was, the shriekometer was turned on. And it's very interesting if you watch the shriekometer working. I told you earlier, it's just like Bill Cosby's routine, the chicken heart that ate up New York City. First it's eating New York City, but then it's coming to your state, and then it's coming to your door. So literally a week ago, ISIS is in Europe and he's killing Parisians, but then he's going to Germany and he's going to all these different places in Europe, and whoops, he's coming across the border into the United States. Whoops, it's every state because we're sending refugees to every state. Whoops, it's in your state. It's in your, ISIS is at your door.
Mm-hmm.
And within a week, they've gone from Paris to all of Europe to all of North America, and now it's funny because I was having lunch with some wonderful colleagues on Friday, and we were laughing because if you look at the sanctions, what's been promised us is that the United States and G7 knows where every dime is and can turn it off like that.
Right.
So how the boogeyman shriekometer can finance itself all the way to my door and your door when these guys can turn them, it's patently absurd.
Right.
But for some reason, The key is you turn the shriekometer, every time somebody laughs at it because it's so ridiculous, you just turn it up. It's a bully tactic. You just turn it up and intimidate and turn it up and turn it up and turn it up. And at some point, somebody knows that if they laugh about it, at the local civic luncheon, they run the risk that if ISIS is going to chop off anybody's head in America, it will happen to you and your family. It's basically dirtball tactics.
Yes.
So, but what you're watching is another shriekometer. And we've seen a lot of them, Ebola being the next to last, and now we've got the ISIS shriekometer. And it's getting extreme, and you watch when they need to white out financial problems, they can take it to a much higher extreme.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've pointed out some interesting things about ISIS, and we're dealing here with a very unusual group. I'd say its true origins are shrouded in secrecy. But one of the tactics we've used on them are these bunker-busting bombs. It seems like an unusual tactic to use against a ragtag group of mercenaries. And because it suggests, the presence of large-scale underground facilities that they're operating in.
Right. So I'm assuming that ISIS is mercenaries, and mercenaries is an important thing for us to talk about because we are watching, from the Treaty of Westphalia on in the 1600s, we lived in one model, and we are literally shredding up a 400-year-old model and going back to the model we were in before the Treaty of Westphalia, and that's a very important dynamic. So I want to come back and talk about that. But if you look at the bunker buster bombs and the bombing in Syria, it looks to me like, I don't think those facilities were created by ISIS. ISIS didn't have enough time. We're talking about very significant underground infrastructure, and the question is, what is it, who built it, and what is the technology in there that somebody's worried about? Because somebody's worried about what they're up to and what technology they have. And I think part of the squabble between the different factions is, are we gonna keep the technology for ourselves, or are we gonna share it? So that's going on. But the reason I think we don't really understand the game in the Middle East for the last 10 to 15 years is we don't know what's really going on underground there. And something's going on. Organized crime, Russian mafia, whatever, is definitely part of the picture.
Huh.
They're definitely there. So, I don't know, but I think if I could ask the genie one question, it would be, who built those underground facilities? What's in them? And what's the technology that everybody's fighting over here?
Well, it's a really good question. So when you look at all that, is Mr. Global on the move?
Oh, I mean, Mr. Global, uh, you know, as far as I can tell, is running this. So, and he seems to be running both sides.
Well, this is a shrewd game that he's played before, and this does bring us around to this question of private armies and the Treaty of Westphalia that you mentioned. Can you tell us about that here?
The Treaty of Westphalia um, basically created a set of principles that said within a geographical location, the sovereign government has a monopoly in force.
All right.
So if you're in the United States, the US government has sovereign ability to use force. No one else may use force.
Right.
Okay. It's a governmental authority. And it's, in the United States, it's sort of parsed out between state, local, and federal. Now, what has happened over the last 20 years, really, or 30 years, from 1980 on, we have, as a nation, seeded phenomenal private intelligence agencies and armies. We've created companies that can field very significant private intelligence and military capacity. And we hear all sorts of rumors of additional private intelligence and military capacity. And we are now looking at a situation where, Daniel, within a jurisdiction, the sovereign government doesn't have a monopoly on force. We're back to a world where feudal lords, aka corporations, the Vatican, different private parties, organized crime, and the sovereign government all have the ability to bring force. Part of the problem with being the serfs is you're dealing with 20 different parties who can bring force to bear. And there's no way you have enough resources to make a deal with all of them. And the way they can settle their fights is to agree to steal from you.
Huh.
So,
Well, that's a
you
bad
know, that,
solution.
well, but when you look at what's going on in the Middle East, if you look at the number of parties who have the ability to bring force, ISIS does, ISIS gets a paycheck, whether by selling oil or whoever is financing them. Somebody writes their check. And literally G7 has the ability through the payment systems to identify every dime and cut them off.
Yes.
So who's paying them? This is simple. You know, if they don't get their check, they don't fight.
Yeah,
So,
right, right.
right. And you're in an area where you're imploding the economy, so it's real easy to pick up a lot of people cheap.
Hmm.
Right. So follow the money.
Yes, no question. And it seems like at this point, what you're saying is the end of the Treaty of Westphalia, this period that we're in now,
Right.
is actually a kind of dangerous situation because you're coming into a new election year. And when these forces take power in 2016, they're going to be looking at fundamentally reengineering the entire government to compensate for this new kind of, let's call it, Hunger Games reality.
Right. Well, you're coming into an inflection point in the federal budget. You have to radically re-engineer. And because all the global financial markets globally work off of the federal budget, you're talking about something that basically involves everybody. That's a big reinvention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could be looking at a very different country by the end of the next president's first term, America 2020.
Well, here, and this is why it's so important for each county to assert adult supervision of the money in their county. I, as a citizen, if I try and assert adult supervision over anything outside my county, the bandwidth is too wide. I really don't have jurisdiction. But if I can at least assert adult supervision, then I can re-optimize the money in a way that's great for the taxpayers and great for my local economy. If 3,100 counties do it, we've got a fighting chance. If we don't, what's going to come top down is certifiably, it's as insane as what's going on in education and healthcare. That's what a top-down re-engineering does. It basically says, okay, let's re-engineer this to clamp down, but make sure we can get every dime for our publicly traded stocks and outsource stuff to Asia. I mean, by the time this is over, you're going to have to go down to, some health clinic and get online with a doctor in Malaysia, through Silicon Valley information systems, and the whole thing's going to be nuts.
Right.
I mean, it's nuts now. It's going to be worse.
Yes. Well, it'll be a fully implemented machine with dangerous implications. I agree.